Have you ever wondered about one of history's most chilling and secretive prison systems, which shattered millions of lives? Join me as we unravel the tragic story of the Soviet Gulag, a vast network of labor camps that tormented innocent people and played a crucial role in shaping the USSR's dark past. Welcome to our channel. Here we explore the captivating and sometimes shocking stories from history that have shaped our world. If you're as fascinated by history as we are, join our community of history enthusiasts by subscribing to our channel. Let's get started. Do you know what the Gulag means? It's an abbreviation for the Russian phrase, Main Labor Administration. It all started back in 1917 after the Russian Revolution. Vladimir Lenin, the guy who founded the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was in charge. But when he died in 1924, Joseph Stalin took over and he ruled Russia with an iron fist. The Gulag actually began under Lenin in 1919, and by 1921 there were already 84 camps. But when Stalin stepped in, things really took off. He saw the camps as a smart way to help the Soviet Union become more industrialized and grab hold of valuable resources like coal, minerals, and timber. During Stalin's Great Purge, anyone who disagreed with him or his party ended up in Gulag camps. It was a terrible way to shut people up. The Gulag wasn't about punishing criminals, it was more about the government keeping everyone in check. Sadly, millions of innocent folks got caught up in this awful scheme, and it's considered one of the darkest times of the 20th century. Can you imagine? Millions of people were sent to the Gulag and forced to work their fingers to the bone for 5 to 20 years. They had to slog away in fields and mines, often without proper clothes, tools, shelter, food, or even clean water. The number of people who died from hunger, disease, violence, or the cold is just too high to count. Although more people were held in the Gulag for longer periods than in Nazi concentration camps, not many people know about it. Even the poor farmers couldn't escape its clutches. Back in 1930, the Soviet government introduced this crazy rule. Farmers had to hand over all their grain to the government. If anyone dared to keep some for themselves, they'd be accused of hoarding and face some serious consequences. Similarly, the term kulak, which really means fist, was used for any successful farmer suspected of using non-Soviet methods to grow crops and raise animals. Can you believe that just owning a single cow could get you labeled as an anti-Soviet? Between 1930 and 1933, over 2 million farmers were shipped off to Siberia and another 100,000 were being sent to the Gulag. Arrests for so-called anti-Soviet behavior were pretty consistent every year, but when Sergei Kirov, the head of the Communist Party in Leningrad and a buddy of Stalin's, was killed, it ignited a massive wave of arrests and executions that claimed thousands of lives. The night Kirov was murdered, Stalin himself shouted that everyone involved in anti-Soviet terrorism should be executed. And then, from July of 1937 to November of 1938, there was this terrifying period where the sole purpose was to eliminate anyone seen as a threat to the Soviet government. First, they arrested Communist Party members for counter-revolutionary activities, then their families, and finally the general public. It was so scary that it became known as the Great Terror throughout history. In those penal colonies, there were basically two types of prisoners. First, you had those who committed some really serious crimes like murder, rape, or robbery, stuff that would get you in trouble pretty much anywhere. Even in the camps, some of these folks just couldn't help themselves and they'd continue their criminal activities, like stealing supplies from trucks before they could hand out clothes or food. Then there were people whose crimes were so minor they wouldn't even be considered criminal in other countries. Think about stuff like stealing bread from a restaurant kitchen just to feed your kids. Most of the inmates in the Gulag system fell into this criminal category and were sentenced to 8 to 10 years of back-breaking labor. And get this, their trials barely lasted 5 minutes. How crazy is that? Now, when it comes to political prisoners, there were some who genuinely opposed Soviet rule, but most of them ended up behind bars with labels like anti-Soviet based on false accusations. Interestingly, politically motivated prisoners never made up more than 25% of the total population. Did you ever wonder what happened to the families of those inmates? Well, the wives and children of prisoners also faced some pretty rough consequences. When husbands were locked up in the Gulag, their wives and children often felt the backlash. They'd worry that friends and neighbors might turn against them. Sometimes the wives were even worse off than their imprisoned husbands. More often than not, these women would lose their jobs and homes, forcing them to sell their belongings just to get by. They'd have to rely on occasional work or the kindness of others to survive. And the worst part? Most wives had no clue where their husbands were being held. Now, if both parents ended up in prison, their kids would be sent to live with relatives or another city or placed in orphanages. Teachers would be cautious about getting too friendly with these kids, not wanting to seem like they were on the side of the enemies. During the Great Terror alone, a staggering 15,347 children were put into orphanages as a result of their parents' arrests. And babies born in the camps? They'd spend their first 2 years with their mothers before being shipped off to orphanages too. Now, let's talk about the prisoners' lives, which were, to put it mildly, pretty rough. The Gulag prisoners were put to work on massive construction, mining, and manufacturing projects. The type of work they did depended on the camp's location and what was needed in the area. Some huge Soviet projects like the Moscow-Volga Canal, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, and the Kolyma Highway were all built using Gulag labor. These poor inmates were given only basic flimsy tools and no protective gear. Some of them had to use handsaws and pickaxes to chop down trees and dig into frozen ground. Others worked in coal or copper mines or shoveled dirt by hand. In a desperate attempt to avoid hard labor, some prisoners would even injure themselves by cutting their hands with axes or sticking their arms into a wood furnace. The prisoners had to work in awful weather conditions even when the temperatures dipped below zero. They faced long hours and limited food supply, with their rations tied to meeting work quotas. The Gulag's living conditions were terrible, with freezing temperatures and overcrowded, unsanitary housing. If workers tried to resist, they risked being attacked or even shot by the guards. Many died from exhaustion or these brutal assaults. It's estimated that at least 10% of the entire Gulag population was killed each year. The lucky ones who survived their time in the Gulag were eventually set free. Family members of suspected traitors, for example, might face a minimum of 5 to 8 years in prison. Some prisoners could get out early if they worked exceptionally hard and exceeded their quotas. Between 1934 and 1953, annual Gulag releases ranged from 150,000 to 500,000. But everything has an end. You know, the Gulag system was actually dismantled shortly after Stalin's death in 1953. Within just a few days, over 1 million inmates were set free. Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, openly criticized the dictator's mass incarceration and purge policies, as well as many of his other actions. But that doesn't mean that the camps disappeared entirely. Some of these buildings were still used as prisons in the 1970s and 1980s, housing criminals, democratic activists, and anti-Soviet nationalists. It wasn't until around 1987 that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev started the process of shutting the camps down for good. Once the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the world finally grasped the full extent of the Gulag system's atrocities. While we had films and photographs from inside European concentration camps during World War II, the Gulag remained largely hidden from view. That is, until the Russian historian Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Gulag survivor himself, wrote The Gulag Archipelago. When it was published in Western Europe and North America in 1973, it shed light on the brutal prison system and the devastating impact it had on the families of those imprisoned. Solzhenitsyn was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970, but the Soviet Union expelled him in 1974. He didn't return to Russia until 1994. The horrors of the Gulag left deep scars on generations of Russians. Even today, some survivors are too traumatized to share their experiences. The legacy of the Gulag continues to haunt Russia and its people. While the Soviet Union might have dissolved, the memories and pain still linger. Some survivors and their families still struggle with the trauma, making it difficult for them to share their stories. But it's essential to remember and learn from this dark period in history to prevent it from ever happening again. Efforts have been made to commemorate the victims and educate future generations about the Gulag system. Museums, like the Gulag History Museum in Moscow, display exhibits and personal belongings of the victims, providing a glimpse into the harrowing experiences they endured. In addition, memorial sites have been established at various former camp locations to honor those who suffered and perished in the Gulag. With greater awareness and understanding of the Gulag's horrors, it's crucial to keep this history alive, both for the healing of survivors and their families and as a stark reminder for future generations. By doing so, we can hope to foster empathy, compassion, and vigilance against any such system that may threaten human rights and dignity. How can we, as a global community, ensure that the lessons learned from the Gulag's dark history continue to resonate and inspire us to stand up against injustice and protect human rights for all? Please let us know in the comments section below.